Hi, everybody, and welcome to this on-demand webcast brought to you by Dell Technologies and Cognizant. My name is Jim Malone. I'm a senior content strategist at IDG, and we're delighted you can join us. Now, the migration to the cloud is in full force. Cloud initiatives figure prominently in IDG's State of the CIO survey, where we gauge priorities for IT leaders for the upcoming year. Cloud priorities are among the top initiatives for investment, hiring, application migration, enabling remote work, security. You get the picture. But to be successful with cloud takes planning and strategy. Today's session will be a fireside chat format to explore some of the nuances and key considerations for hybrid cloud success. And to do that, we have a pair of experts on hand. It's going to be a great session. We're glad you're here. So let's meet our speakers first up. First up is Paul Hammond. Paul's Vice President, CIS at Cognizant. Paul, tell us a little bit about your role at Cognizant.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thanks for the introduction. So my role at Cognizant is global, firstly, and it's to cover all of the activity we do in what we call our Cloud Plus practice, helping clients to both manage legacy infrastructure that they maybe have collated over years, but nevertheless can be critical to their business outcomes. But also, underpin their digital aspirations with modernized and transformed IT infrastructure, which obviously has a key play connected to cloud activity and cloud technology.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Glad you could be with us today. And let's say hello to David Sarson. David is the Global Managing Director for Alliances with Dell Technologies. Hey, David, thanks so much for being with us. Tell us about your work at Dell.
Real pleasure, Jim. Thanks very much. David Sarson, working at Dell now for close to 8 years, and we partner with Cognizant. My role is specifically there in the customers that Cognizant has, as do we in all the globe, focusing on that cloud environment. I think there's a lot of aspects in cloud that are valuable that we see. Dell has embraced the cloud in many, many ways, and the key is that transformation into the cloud and what works. That's really what my role is, focused on helping companies do that, working with Paul and his teams, making sure that those alignments and engagements come to fruition for the customers.
Thanks, David. Really glad you could be with us today. Now, before we get started, I want to just point out a couple of housekeeping items to help you get the most out of today's session. We're coming to you on demand. We can't take your questions live, but we still want to hear from you. Just use the Ask a Question widget on your player. We'll get your question. You'll hear back from us in just a couple of business days. Of course, there's lots more resources and assets from our sponsor on today's topic in the resources section of your player. We encourage you to take advantage, download those, share them with friends, colleagues, prospects, etc. And finally, a big thanks to our sponsor, Dell Technologies, for making this event possible. So let's get started. I just want to take a minute, David and Paul, to set the stage. Besides the cloud migration I mentioned at the top, the pandemic has been an enormous driver for digital transformation and cloud migration. Now, we've all heard that data point that COVID accelerated digital transformation projects by 3 to 4 years. In other words, 3 to 4 years of transformation in 3 months or so. And we've seen public cloud take its place as a large part of any digital transformation strategy. But cloud first isn't always the best strategy. Make no mistake, cloud's going to be a big part of any transformation strategy, but it takes diligence and planning. So David, I want to start with you. Let's start at the beginning. Moving everything into the cloud, that isn't a strategy, you say. But what challenges are you seeing among folks who maybe have taken that as kind of their first approach? What are you hearing out there?
Yeah, I think there are a number of variables in that question, and I can break down a couple. First and foremost, I think with the pandemic, with some of the changes that have gone on in all of our workspaces, Dell has really stepped up in a number of areas just around what we're best known for on the laptop side, on the workstation, by providing those to thousands and even hundreds of thousands of customers who had employees who are now working from home. That's been one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the past 2 years. I think then into the other areas that Dell focuses on, we've really embraced the cloud starting, about 10 years ago, really, when we went after we had a lot of the on-premise environments And that's the way most companies dealt with IT and their services. With the hyperscalers coming, mainly Azure, Google, and AWS, those three have really built that public environment very strongly and works in many, many cases very well. But the key pieces that I've found that people aren't focusing always on when it comes to developing that planning and sort of preparing for the cloud is around workloads and runtime. Really what's important is where is the data and where is the actual application being run? And then where is it best run? Some of the agile environments that people have work perfectly in the cloud because they were built for the cloud. Some of the others that are legacy and not as agile, not as able to get into a DevOps environment for development, they have more challenges around putting those completely in the cloud. And what we've found, just as a broad brush, is that most of our customers are embracing a hybrid cloud. That includes the best elements of on-prem, not getting bogged down by having all the hardware and software elements on their own premise that they're responsible for, but really having those elements that can work in the cloud do that well, and then keep the on-prem environments, whether it's data security, whether it's making sure you don't have the latency that's in the public clouds. That environment called the hybrid cloud is really what we're focused on and what most of our customers are embracing and finding the best success rather than doing one or only the other.
Paul, from the Cognizant point of view, what's the take there? What are you seeing?
Yeah, good question. We're seeing similar things. I think that the pattern, and David alluded to it with the kind of 10-year. If we go back 10 years, some of this stuff isn't maybe as new as we're thinking it is now. But the technology's advanced at a massive rate of change, both in terms of the kind of equipment you would install on-prem, with Dell, or the hyperscaler capabilities that we see, that are largely badged as public cloud. What we've seen is there was a kind of rush to do cloud first. I think a lot of people have gone down that route, and sometimes for very good reason. If you had legacy assets that were needing refreshing and you wanted to go for a low asset intensity strategy as a CIO, you would clearly see the ability to use somebody else's IaaS and not invest, not have CapEx, not have to maintain your own equipment like you've done maybe for the last 20 or so years, as an attractive option. But what we've seen in some of that, moving applications and workloads to the cloud that maybe weren't the most appropriate, but they kind of followed that cloud first approach, is latency issues, data sovereignty issues, and even TCO issues, where actually relatively static workloads that are not necessarily well optimized for the cloud can actually work out not being cost effective when you move them to the public cloud. So we've seen clients that have either, and I don't want to say everybody's slowed down their cloud, mobilization, because that's definitely not the case, but we've seen maybe an adjustment in what the focus is of moving to cloud. Where I've spoken to, a couple of banking customers of ours who said, we've had to rethink what we put up on the cloud. Where we thought we could put 90% of the applications, we're going to detune that because the latency just isn't working for us on a number of key apps that are, business outcome affecting. I mean, if these are back office things that don't have, latency doesn't matter, well, okay, you can probably carry on. But that's then driving the need for a multi-cloud or a smarter, we talk about cloud smart now. It's driving the need for a slightly smarter approach. And then when you combine that with the other topic, where I think people have had to catch up a little bit on some of the people, process, and business interface sides of the IT equation. It's very easy to, and we all do it. I've been in technology many, many years. I'm an engineer by training. We rush to adopt the technology, and then we work out that our processes and our skills and certain people are not maybe as best geared up to optimize and run it as we thought they were. And in some cases, the business don't, when you work in an IT bubble, particularly in the kind of world of a CIO, where you don't get enough exposure to the business, you're not always giving the business the information or even the outcomes they necessarily need. So, we've got to catch up on some of that connection as well.
Thanks, Paul. David, from the Dell Technologies lens, when we talk about customers that have legacy and new applications at the same time, which I'm going to guess is probably the vast majority, how can they avoid a bimodal IT work stream, but why is a bimodal work stream bad, first of all?
Yeah, the bimodal work stream, the biggest challenge with that deals with costs, in that you're building a new environment in an environment, whether it's in a public cloud or a private cloud, but you're building that type of development cycle. And then you're also having the legacy applications that are on older equipment in data centers that need either refresh or need to be migrated. So those two areas can become very, very expensive, and you need two different types of personnel to work on each of those systems. Ones that are more container-based, more along the lines of agile development, compared to more waterfall releases, more long-term, more older types of development cycles. That's the real challenge there, is the people, that you have to have both people working, as well as having the costs of both centers.
Paul, that's really interesting that both you and David have kind of brought up the people aspect in your last two responses. Paul, from your point of view, this bimodal, what are some of the pitfalls of this bimodal work stream?
I think, yeah, and it's a good topic to pick up on, because I think we often have conversations with clients about their need to reskill their retained IT talent into the new. That's the DevOps, the containers, the full stack engineering type things, and take a pod approach to how you do things in the kind of new world, with a foot in the one side of the bimodal. But often those IT staff are the very people that have got all the skills, knowledge, and crucially the awareness of how the legacy systems work. So often there's a kind of you're running these two parallel streams, when actually most of the staff that are working in your organization that understand your business best, which is inevitably going to be your retained IT organization, are stuck in the old. So you've got those, as David says, you've got the risk of attrition, you've got the risk of the knowledge going out the door, and you've also got the risk that your existing staff kind of get overwhelmed by arguably any of the SIs, any service providers that you bring in. And you've got to be very careful to make sure that you don't let that happen, I think, because that's a pitfall or a danger zone for the bimodal. And I think what you've got to be doing is asking your service provider, your partner, particularly when it comes to how you acquire some of those new skills, to backfill some of the legacy, as well as help educate you on the new. And I've seen varying degrees of success in the market, in different industry sectors, in how that gets achieved. But it is something you need to really carefully think about, the talent rotation, both in terms of what you've got now in picking up the new skills, and also how you bring in, in some cases, we see clients running very, very good apprenticeship schemes, graduate schemes, freshers, that kind of thing, to bring into the new skills. But you need to cross-fertilize those, and you need to use your services, partnerships, and other mechanisms that you can use, training and education programs that exist in the market, generally, to make sure that you seed, into the existing and the new, so that you can run these new environments. And eventually, when you turn off the legacy, which may be 10 years time, it may be 2 years time, you're not stuck with the wrong skills on the wrong side of the bimodal fence, as it were.
Interesting. David, how are you seeing that play out? That, this kind of intersection of the people and the technology part is really interesting. How are you seeing that play out along the lines that Paul just mentioned?
Yeah, I think the technology piece is quite sound, right? We know most of the elements that are there. We can learn about them. We can become educated. What I find is similar to what Paul was saying in the people, as far as being able to align them to the right technologies. And that's where I'm so grateful to be at Dell, where we get to see the Fortune 5000 companies, because we work with them. And we get to see what really works when it comes to integrating people and the tools into environments that will be successful for our customers. And the part that I'm so proud of and happy to be with Cognizant as one of our lead partners is that what they have in the skills around implementing those technologies and architectures that we've worked out together is top drawer. So what it gives is not only the ability to get the technology that Dell has created to be able to implement that, whether it's in an on-prem, off-prem environment, whether the people are involved, whether the tools are in the right place at the right time. But we have a way to implement that in a proven way, really, with the work that Cognizant has done and that we've done together. So I think those are the two main things that I find really exciting about that stage of the people and the tools that we're at now in the cloud environments that I'm seeing being developed out in our customer base.
Yeah, I want to dive into the Dell and Cognizant piece of that in a little bit. But first, Paul, I'm going to ask you, you use a term called cloud smart, or the term cloud smart. Explain what you mean by that approach and why it's beneficial to modernization.
Yeah, I think happy to do that. And I think the reason I deliberately use that phrase rather than cloud first is because I think we've sort of by osmosis moved into that phase now because of the issues we talked about earlier, where things didn't always work out, whether it was the ROI, the TCO, the data sovereignty, the legacy, the latency, etc. So what I mean by cloud smart is a slightly different approach in terms of you're modernizing, retiring, and replacing in maybe a slightly more phased way, which I get doesn't sound as agile as perhaps people want to run at high speed, and I get that with the digital transformation agenda. You absolutely need to do that, and you will be under massive pressure as a CIO, to provide those kind of capabilities to your business, particularly in a world now where that agility means that the business really wants to have an idea on a Monday morning, and by a Friday afternoon they want a fully baked kind of at least a proof of concept running on a cloud with SaaS technologies integrated to some legacy mainframes that maybe provide the system of record data. That's the kind of pressure that the customers that we deal with are under, and the kind of work we do to help them in that collaborative way. But I think you've got to be smart about the way you do that, because not everything is going to move to the cloud to enable you to deliver some of those business outcome that your board or your CEO is demanding, in terms of, if we're not in this market, we don't have a kind of digital engagement system for customers, we're going to lose market share. All of those kind of typical business level conversations that manifest into a technology discussion or a technology need, in the sense of the kind of role a lot of our clients are providing to their internal consumers, if you like. And the danger is, and I've seen this in practice, I've worked with some clients in the last 3 or 4 years who were very, very aggressively moving SAP workloads to public cloud. And again, it may come back to that, I needed to get out of the data center, I needed to sell the data center, the lease was coming up, the equipment was going end of life, etc. So there's some very good, compelling reasons why you may have done it. But the business heard the word we're moving, or heard the phrase, I should say, we're moving, the SAP instances to the cloud, and had an expectation that meant that SAP was going to do something way different, in terms of business capability than it was doing yesterday. Sadly, they came in on Monday morning, logged into their SAP and said, okay, so it's running on the cloud, but I've got exactly the same functionality. Because what they didn't get on Monday morning was an S4 HANA upgrade that suddenly did real-time stock analysis, which could improve the cash flow impact. So you've got to be very careful that you don't do cloud first instead of cloud smart and end up ultimately disappointing a lot of the stakeholders who thought they were going to see something slightly different. So I think if you just slow down a little bit, in terms of the phasing, the planning, the conversations that you need to have with the business, around the innovation life cycle, I think you can get a better outcome. And that's kind of encapsulates what I mean by, be cloud smart. We see, some of the huge capabilities that the hyperscalers bring around, API connected economy, which you can leverage, in a much better way from a business outcome perspective. And that's definitely a value that you can achieve, as long as you've got the right business applications and so on, and they're modernized. But equally recognizing that, certainly for us, working with Fortune 200, Fortune 100 type clients, these guys have got IT infrastructures that go back 30 years, and sadly I am that old. I can remember the implementation of some of them, and many of them, are still systems of record that have been running for 20 years, which is perhaps a scary thought. But in cloud smart, you've got to think about, the old and the new, and how do you get best leverage and integrate both, so that you get a better business outcome. But equally, it doesn't mean that everything just gets moved overnight and then you don't get a better business outcome, but you set the expectation you would. So it's about those kind of things. And as we referenced earlier, you've still got to think about the other parameters of how you run the IT shop, the people, the process. One of the other things I've seen, if I can elaborate a little bit around the tooling point that David made, is that when you're running that kind of multifaceted IT environment in a large IT shop, for an global enterprise type client, you are likely to need new tooling for being able to get a lens on the new type of capabilities you've deployed right back into the legacy capabilities. So for example, you start to get into needing tooling that 5 years ago nobody knew they needed, like application performance management, which is a bit like looking at a process flow rather than an IT asset type oversight. And that becomes crucially important as an enabler to be able to see, is a user getting a bad experience because it's something to do with the network, or is it because the data they're pulling through a brand new cloud-based application is not talking properly to something, kind of hybrid, private cloud instance that we've had to put in place for data protection, for example. So where's the problem in that process flow? So you've got to start thinking about, like an oil refinery, end-to-end process flow rather than a traditional IT asset instances.
I'm sorry, if I could just add on to what Paul was saying, because I thought he made a great point just around Cloud Smart and specifically around that danger of public and private and how to choose and what to do. If I could bring it just to an experience that I had while at Dell being a sales manager in the field, because I agree with everything that Paul outlined there on how to look at things and how to deal with the choices and what those options are. But that danger I experienced when I was working with a grocery chain, a very large one, about 4 years ago. And we had decided to build a a hybrid cloud for them and have the bursting elasticity into the hyperscalers when needed, but then have the main data and workload be done on-prem for some security reasons. There were some HIPAA issues just around the pharmacies that were in half of their stores, and a couple other areas. So what we decided to do was build that on-prem and burst into the public cloud as needed. Why we did that was we didn't want to use, as Paul mentioned, the API libraries. We didn't want to be hard-coded, if you will, into that environment. We wanted to have that flexibility. And if I could choose 2 words for Dell, is flexibility and options. Really, that's what I focus on when we're with our customers. So we went ahead with this project. It was a 9-month project. And 3 months into the project, Amazon, which was the hyperscaler we decided to work with, chose to buy Whole Foods. And with that purchase, that large retail chain, that large grocery chain said, we do not want to give our money to Amazon because they're a competitor now. And I think because we built it as a hybrid cloud, meaning the operations and the tools that were needed to have workloads be defined on-prem or off-prem was done in their own environment, they didn't have to worry about the API libraries recoding anything. We stayed on our 9-month project plan. We came in on time. And most importantly, we were able to say, it's a networking call. Let's go to another public cloud. And it doesn't matter, where should we go? And I think it was a real eye-opening experience for me following the whole process, as that's the value of a hybrid cloud. For me, I mean, I have other examples we can talk about, but that brought it home for me to say, you don't really know what's coming, but if you keep control of your data, if you keep ownership of the key pieces, then you're able to make those choices and have those options and flexibility that I see Dell Technologies giving our customers the choice, and the partnership with Cognizant to give that and deliver it, not just give the framework and the tools, but actually run it, support them if they don't want to deal with that headache, because it can be challenging, upgrades and all the other issues. That's a huge part of what our relationship is about.
We'll talk about an external event, right? That you couldn't have foreseen.
Yeah.
Right, your unknown unknowns coming up right there.
Right, in real time. It was crazy, real time. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. So let's talk about, that old saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. Let's talk about ROI for a little bit. There's a couple of lenses we can look at this through, David, through the business lens, through the IT lens. How do you recommend, and Paul, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, but David, let's start with you. How do you recommend IT leaders think about that ROI part of this?
Yeah, the key piece is, what are the objectives? What do they want to accomplish? I use the example a lot of ride sharing and Uber and Lyft and purchasing a car. Uber is great. You jump in it, you go across town and you get out, and you don't have all the same things in IT. You don't have a driver, a knowledge base of how to drive. You don't have insurance. You don't have maintenance on the car, and you don't have parking. You don't have to put it anywhere. All the same things parallel to IT. If you're going from New York to Los Angeles or New York to London, a car's not a great choice, number one. So there are other options. You can get in an airplane to go to London, but more on the US side, if you're going across, you can do drive away, and in 7 days, you bring someone else's car across the country and you get paid for it. That's another cost-effective way. You can lease a car, you can buy a car. The whole question is, what are the business outcomes that we're after? We hear that a lot right now in the industry, but by understanding just those basic broad areas of what a business is trying to do, we as a Dell Cognizant partnership can start addressing exactly what that is and what the needs are, without creating it new, but using the best practices that we have from all the customers we've been doing this with for years, really, and bring that best of breed answer and solution to IT executives. And that's the best part, I feel, about some of those architectures that we've developed, that they're proven.
Paul, from the Cognizant point of view and these engagements, how does ROI figure into the discussions and the planning? At what stage or how does that play out?
Yeah, good question. We have a full spectrum of services that we work closely with clients on, and obviously in partnership with Dell, the Dell guys as well. And it can depend on where the client is on the journey. So if you think about our services, we've got full, everything from the very, very early stages of consulting and advisory, where we would do that business case, we would do the analysis, both at the TCO ROI perspective, but also the technical assessment, of the what are the refactoring, the containerizing, the kind of costs involved in the application, to at least get it more portable so that it can be moved to either an on-prem cloud or a public cloud. Going right through the project phases of planning, design, planning, architecture, implementation, then actually run. So we will run public cloud, multi-cloud instances for clients, which will also include the legacy that we talked about earlier. So we've got many examples today where we're running, from an operational perspective, 24/7, every aspect of a client's IT, including what you would call the digital modern and the legacy, and it's coexisting in that model that David referred to earlier. What we don't always get, though, is the kind of journey starting at A going through to E. We sometimes get clients saying, well, we've already done the analysis, we've already had the assessment and the business case piece done. Now we'd like you, Cognizant, to help us with the major risky migration component of it, because we think you've got credibility and capability there. That's quite common. We often get involved in the assessment and the project and migration aspects. And to be honest, for the run aspects of it, that's often an existing customer today. That's often an existing customer conversation saying, hey, you run a lot of my IT infrastructure for me now. I want to add in cloud components. Can you manage that for me as well? There'll come a time, I think, where we start to see more of the customers that have probably got more things on the cloud, where we'll get brand new engagements where it will be 90% cloud and 10% legacy, but that's probably the journey. That's just a byproduct of the journey everybody's on right now and where they are with it.
Thanks, Paul. We're chatting with Paul Hammond with Cognizant, David Sarson with Dell Technologies. Decades of experience between the both of you, right on the front lines of this modernization and migration trend we're seeing. I want to ask, what advice can you offer IT leaders as far as managing these hybrid environments goes? And Paul, let's stick with you first. And let's keep it to a few bullet points. What advice for managing these hybrid environments?
I think Yeah, good question. Hard to do that in a couple of bullets, as you probably guessed. So I think you come back to my cloud smart, philosophy earlier on. I think you've got to think about that what are you going to modernize, retire, replace on that technology landscape front? How are you going to embrace and leverage to the business outcome benefits, the digital enablers of the containerization, the DevOps type technologies, this full stack engineering type capability that you need? Combine that with how you go and access those skills, both using what you can get in the market, from the likes of Cognizant and others, but how you also bring your own organization along that journey, because I think you need to do both, not one or the other. And then I think you need to keep a close eye on the instrumentation and the tooling, because you are going to need new things or different things when you're running that much more complex, foot in each camp environment, tomorrow than you were maybe yesterday. And then lastly, I think you need to keep a very keen eye on the total cost of ownership and the ROI, because if you've put things in the wrong place, as David referred to earlier, you need to be bold enough to say, we need to change that, we need to bring it back, we need a different solution for that particular set of business applications. If they're more static than you thought they were, they're not as dynamic, you don't need to scale up, scale down, which of course are all things that lend themselves much more readily to the hyperscaler aspects of how you would provision that versus the maybe slightly more static or less workload dynamic private cloud instances, and make sure that whole multi-cloud solution is coherent end to end and isn't fragmented across your organization. I think that's probably my key points on that.
Thanks, Paul. I know it was tough to do in 3 bullet points, but one of the questions that comes to mind, are you seeing in your engagements, you seeing folks settle on one hyperscaler, or are they spreading things out? And does that matter? And David, love to get your thoughts, but let's start with Paul.
Yeah, I see a combination of things actually, which is a slightly more complex answer than maybe you were expecting. But so go back to David's example earlier. I have seen, or I've had conversations with clients who are concerned about using one hyperscaler over another because they see them as a potential competitor in their market. And that's particularly prevalent in retail and in insurance, interestingly, where there may be plans or there may not be plans, for that particular hyperscaler to extend their business in that place. And there's a concern about data and how that could be accessed, etc. Rightly or wrongly, that's a reason why people might avoid one hyperscaler. Generally speaking, though, most large corporations that we work with in particular, at the kind of spend levels that they would be committing to both their on-prem IT equipment and their hyperscaler usage, are still very driven by their procurement organizations, making sure that they get best value for money in the market, perfectly reasonable and understandable. And consequently, my experience is that you often get those types of clients saying, we will always need to use at least 2, if not 3 of the hyperscalers. And we typically know who they are. It's Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And then that's from a pricing competitiveness perspective, and that's exactly just like the market we Cognizant operate in on a daily basis. And then there's a kind of nuance of that, which is, okay, if I'm going to use more than one, which is the best one to put my new SAP workloads on versus my other types of workloads? Just to give an example, where there might be an advantage going with Microsoft or Amazon or Google, one over the other. So that some of it is functionally, functional decisions, and some of it is financial, in terms of the kind of incentives they get and the competitiveness on the day of any given offer that they're made by those public cloud providers. There is one last point I would add, which is, regarding portability and lock-in, there is concern, and I've done some work recently with public sector clients where, due to the nature of public sector procurement, number one, and due to the nature of just competitiveness generally, even in the private sector, there is an element of always having to use more than one to make sure that they're always, perception being that they're always getting the best deal. Now, that's not so easy to do if your workloads aren't that portable. So put that caveat out there on that point. But there's a number of factors that are driving people into that, multi-hyperscaler use, on-prem, reasons for doing both, and reasons for not, either not wanting to think they might be locked in, or not wanting to think that there's a competitive, disadvantage to using one or the other.
Yeah, David, and thinking back to your comments about flexibility and options, I would think that plays in here as far as what you're seeing with folks either settling on one hyperscaler or kind of spreading the wealth, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the same flexibility and options that I was discussing earlier with Dell and what we offer. The reason that's so important, and Paul articulated very well on those elements, and maybe I can bring it to a real world example that I lived through that will shed some light on that. And I will use names here just because it is public, there are books written on this. When Netflix decided to go to a streaming environment, it was in the 2000s to 2010, I think it was 2007 or 6, somewhere in there. Blockbuster was the company to go get movies from. And when they made that decision, they partnered with a small bookseller called Amazon. And I chuckle just saying that because if we remember, that's where they started as a bookseller. And that's how they did their business. And as it grew, because they wrote into the API libraries, they were beholden to AWS. I believe it was 2014, but right in there before 2015, Amazon put $4 billion into content creation. At that moment, they became competitors. And during that time, Netflix had a project called Chaos Monkey, because what they did building into Amazon, they said, what if the Northeast goes away and that data center is done? Can we still be up and running? What's brilliant about what they did was they developed and they actually did that in production, which still brings my hairs on the back of my neck to stand because that's crazy talk. But they did it and they still do it. They had another smaller popularized idea called Armageddon Monkey. And that was about what if Amazon went away? They're one company that they're beholden to. What if everything drops, networks go haywire or whatever, the magnetic field switch on the earth or whatever happens. And the answer was they're down. I'm sure they fixed that by now. This was quite a while ago when I had them as an account. But I think the most important thing here again is let's focus on what the outcomes are. Everything looks good in the cloud. There's no question, because we hear our customers say it all the time. We want to get out of the data center business. We get that. And the things that we're doing and have done at Dell, recognize that and embrace it. We can be an operationalized cost for any company in the world, in any industry. We can do that today. We've been doing it for years. That operational cost, if that's the goal, we're in full support of it, and we'll get you out of the data center business at the next refresh. I think those are the elements that need to get discussed succinctly as possible.
Again, we're chatting with Paul Hammond with Cognizant, David Sarson with Dell Technologies. David and Paul, we're almost at the end of our time, but before we go, I wanted to give you each a chance to kind of just emphasize what you would like readers to take away, or listeners, that is, to take away from today's session. Paul, let's start with you. Some final thoughts.
Yeah, I think that as we've covered in the session so far, this is a complex area. It spans a number of things, and not just technology, as David said earlier. I think advice is to pick the right partner to help you with the strategy, to get the strategy right. That partner really should be seen and should become a trusted advisor, because if they're not, they're probably not a partner. They're just a supplier. And that, I think, will help you link together the business to get the business needs, requirements and outcomes that your business is looking for, but also protect, from the cloud journey, but also protect you in the steps that you take and the investments that you've got already made yesterday and you will make tomorrow. I think that's the key points for me.
David Sarson with Dell Technologies, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think adding to what Paul said, that complexity that he mentioned, I think is growing, and it's getting more and more for customers. The benefit that you have, I think, as a customer of ours, is the ability to look at what others in your industry have been doing over the years. We've grown up through all the changes. Yes, we still manage and work with mainframes. We've gone through the client server. We've gone through all of these changes now into an agile world. We're very, very aware of what those challenges are based on our customer set and working with them globally. And that's what I'm really excited about, is being able to come not with canned solutions that are cookie cutter and just sent to everyone, but more ones that have the ability to have flexibility in them and give you as a customer those options that you can use, because we don't know what's coming, but what we can do is prepare well now. And then when we get there and things start changing and the fan turns brown, we actually can pivot and move to other areas that we can get better at, and bring those new inventions that will be coming. Dell does a lot of them. I know Cognizant does a lot. Being able to bring those into the environments that you have.
Thanks, David. And with that, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time for this session. Again, a big thanks to our guests, Paul Hammond with Cognizant, David Sarson with Dell Technologies. Thanks to you both. Great insights, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Of course, a big thanks to our audience for tuning in. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Dell Technologies and Cognizant, for making today's event possible. Before we go, a quick reminder, check out the additional resources section of your player. You can do a deep dive on today's topic, some really great information that you can download and share with friends, colleagues, prospects, etc. And we recommend that you do that. And with that, for Dell Technologies, Cognizant, and IDG, this is Jim Malone saying thanks everyone for tuning in.